Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring the complex situations surrounding the Mapuche people in Chile and their fight for their ancestral land.
It's a conflict that's been going on for quite a while, actually. And we'll be covering a lot of ground here, from Chile's expansion back in the late 1800s to the policies of Pinochet's dictatorship and how those historical events continue to shape things today.
You know, I was actually looking at some of the source material that we have for today's deep dive, and it's really fascinating. We have reports from journalists who are actually on the ground in Chile. We have interviews with Mapuche leaders, Chilean politicians, and we even have accounts of how Pinochet's regime directly impacted the Mapuche people.
It's sure to be a fascinating journey.
Yeah.
Why don't we start with the Mapuche themselves? I mean, they're the largest indigenous group in Chile. They make up about 12% of the population. And their name, Mapuche, it literally means people of the land.
People of the land. I mean, that's not just a name, right? That seems very central to their identity.
Exactly. Their connection to the land is deeply embedded in their culture, their identity, their spirituality. They have over 2,000 years of history in parts of Chile and Argentina. And what's really interesting is, unlike many other indigenous groups, they were never actually fully conquered by the Spanish. They held onto a huge territory until the 1800s.
Until Chile decided they wanted that land, huh?
Yeah.
And that's when things took a really dark turn.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in the 1880s, Chile started a campaign to seize Mapuche land. And it wasn't just about taking the land. It was about, really dismantling their entire way of life.
Wow.
They suppressed the Mapuche language and culture, and they even incentivized Europeans to settle on Mapuche territory.
It sounds like they were following the playbook for colonization almost to a T.
Yeah.
And some of those same tactics, it seems, were used during Pinochet's dictatorship. He marginalized the Mapuche, he sold off their land, he gave corporations access to their forests and rivers. It's like he was trying to erase them.
The impact of Pinochet's regime was really devastating. And it's worth pointing out that Chile is the only country in Latin America with a constitution that doesn't recognize indigenous people at all.
That's pretty telling. It really is.
Yeah.
But even in the midst of all of this, there's some incredible stories of resistance, like Alberto Curamil. He's a Mapuche Lanka, which means chief for our listeners.
Yes.
And he won the Goldman Environmental Prize, it's often called the Green Nobel, for stopping these two dam projects that would have flooded Mapuche land.
His story is really remarkable. The documentary Chile's Secret War provides a really powerful look into his life and his activism.
Yeah, he's been a tireless advocate for his people, but that fight has come at a great personal cost. He's been imprisoned, he's been beaten, he's even been shot for his activism.
Yeah.
And there's this really powerful scene in the documentary where he's leading this ceremony on a sacred volcano, rallying his community to oppose a geothermal plant.
Yeah.
And you can just feel their connection to the land and their determination to protect it. It really is something else.
It really shows you, like, the Mapuche worldview, their interconnectedness to nature, and that the land isn't just something you own, but something you're a part of.
It's a beautiful way of looking at the world, but it's also a world that is under constant threat.
Absolutely.
And that sort of brings us to the other side of the story, the perspectives of non-Mapuche Chileans.
Right. And those perspectives are pretty diverse. You have folks who sympathize with the Mapuche and see the injustices and support their right to self-determination. And then you have those who see their actions, especially the more militant ones, as a threat.
Yeah, a threat to national security. That seems like kind of a wide gap to bridge. And we have some voices from both sides of this debate, starting with Gloria Neveon.
Gloria Neveon. She's a right-wing congresswoman. She represents the same region where Curamil actually lives. And her perspective is, sort of one that views the Mapuche struggle as a natural part of historical processes.
Yeah, she basically believes that all Chileans, including the Mapuche, should just be grateful for all the progress that Chile has made. Right. Even if that progress came at their expense.
Even if that progress came at their expense, exactly.
And that viewpoint is very different from President Gabriel Boric.
Right. President Boric, with his roots in the student movement, has taken a much more progressive stance, advocating for constitutional recognition of the Mapuche and other indigenous groups. That's huge.
It is huge. And his election back in 2021 was a potential turning point for Chilean politics.
Yeah.
A shift towards social justice and inclusion. But there were challenges right out of the gate. Shortly after his win, a group called the Waikan Akwoka Mapu, which means rebel territory struggle, in English, they burned down 31 holiday cabins.
That was a bold statement.
It was.
I mean, so soon after Boric's election, it really highlights how divided Chilean society is on this issue. And how do you even begin to address this when there are such different ideas about what the solution should even look like? Well, some people, like Navan, believe that dialogue with groups who use violence is just not an option. But others, like Boric, believe that dialogue and reconciliation are essential, even when it's difficult.
And then you have to consider Chile's economic realities, too. I mean, forestry is one of their biggest industries, right?
Yeah.
It's their second largest export. So wouldn't returning land to the Mapuche have a huge impact on Chile's economy?
Yeah, for sure. It's a complicated situation, right? You have historical injustices and social tensions and economic interests all kind of tangled up together. So finding a path forward is really going to require that we acknowledge all of those factors.
Okay, so we've got this really complex situation. We've got a history of oppression, a fight for land and identity, and deep divisions in Chilean society about how to move forward. What happens next?
Well, in 2022, Chile actually held a referendum on a new constitution.
Wait a minute, I remember this. This is the one that was considered like the most progressive in the world, right?
Exactly. It included provisions for indigenous rights, environmental protection, and for the first time ever, it acknowledged the Mapuche and other indigenous nations within Chile as distinct entities. It was a big deal.
So what happened?
Well, it was rejected.
Rejected. But how? With all of those amazing things in it, what went wrong?
It was complicated, really. A bunch of things kind of came together. Disinformation campaigns, people were scared, worried about the economy, thought maybe the Constitution put indigenous rights ahead of everyone else's. And yeah, inflation was pretty bad back then, so people were nervous about change when they were worrying about putting food on the table.
Man, that's a real bummer. It felt like Chile was about to do something really amazing, and, well, it seems like reality just got in the way.
Yeah, it shows how hard it is to make big changes, especially when you're dealing with, all this historical baggage and economic worries. But even though the Constitution failed, the problems are still there. Actually, you could even argue it makes finding a solution even more urgent.
It makes me think about how unique the Mapuche situation is. Are other indigenous groups around the world dealing with the same stuff?
Well, absolutely. What's happening in Chile, it's like a tiny version of this global struggle. Indigenous communities all over, they're dealing with colonialism, loss of land and culture, fighting for recognition, self-determination. It's the same story. Different continents, different details, but the core issues, they're the same.
It's kind of wild how much the past still affects things today, even in a country like Chile, a democracy. You think of Chile as modern, progressive, but then you see how they treat the Mapuche, and, well, it's not a great look.
Yeah, and colonialism, it didn't just disappear overnight, right? You can still see the effects, not just the land they lost, but also these systemic inequalities and prejudices.
Can you explain that a bit? What do you mean by systemic inequalities when it comes to the Mapuche?
Think about it like this. Institutions, policies, even if they don't mean to, they keep certain groups at a disadvantage. So for the Mapuche, it could be things like less access to healthcare, education, economic opportunities, even their language and culture being suppressed.
So it goes deeper than just people being mean to each other. There are these forces working against them that are harder to see.
Exactly. Think about how Pinochet suppressed the Mapuche language, Mapudungun. Losing a language, that's a huge loss of identity, history, a whole way of seeing the world. Even if people are trying to bring it back, those effects, they stick around.
Makes sense. And I guess that all contributes to the prejudice and stereotypes the Mapuche face.
For sure. People think they're less than, their culture is backwards, what they want is unreasonable. These ideas, they get stuck in people's minds, and it's hard to get rid of them, especially with misinformation and lack of understanding.
So you have this wall of prejudice built on history and inequality. It seems impossible, honestly. How do you even start to break something like that down?
Well, it's not easy, that's for sure. But it starts with remembering that everyone is human. You got to educate people, talk openly, and be willing to look at your own biases.
Speaking of bias, one of the things that really shocked me was learning that the Chilean government uses anti-terrorism laws against Mapuche activists. It just seems so extreme.
Yeah, a lot of people around the world are condemning it. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights even said it violates basic human rights. Imagine living in a country that says they love democracy, then they turn around and use those laws to silence people fighting for their land.
It's pretty messed up. Chile likes to think of itself as this democratic leader in Latin America, but if they do this to the Mapuche, it's like they're saying they're not real citizens, that their rights don't matter.
It's all about power. The Chilean government, with all its might, is basically saying the Mapuche are the enemy. That makes finding a peaceful solution almost impossible. It just creates more fear and distrust, which doesn't help anyone.
And I bet that feeds into the story that politicians like Neve push that the Mapuche are dangerous, a threat to Chile.
Right. They take a complex situation and make it simple, making the Mapuche the bad guys, when really it's much more complicated than that.
So how do we move past those stories? How do we deal with the inequality, the historical stuff, the economic concerns? It's a tangled mess.
You need a multi-pronged approach, something that acknowledges the past, addresses the root causes of the inequality, and gets everyone talking.
What would that even look like? Is there a plan for fixing something this complex?
There's not one single plan, but there are some clear things we can do, like recognizing the Mapuche and other indigenous groups in the Constitution. That's symbolic, but it's powerful, saying their culture and rights matter.
But didn't that Constitution get rejected? Are we back to square one?
Not necessarily. The rejection just means we need to educate people better. They need to understand why this recognition is important, not just for the Mapuche, but for Chile as a whole.
Okay, so besides the Constitution, what else? What about the land itself?
Land claims are huge. Maybe a mix of returning land and figuring out ways to manage resources together so the Mapuche have a say in what happens on their land.
Like that geothermal plant Curramil was fighting. Instead of just building stuff on Mapuche land, they should talk to them, get their permission.
Exactly. Respect their culture, their spiritual values, understand how connected they are to the land, figure out how to include their knowledge and ideas in development projects.
But what about the economics? How do you balance development with indigenous rights, especially in a country where industries like forestry are so important?
That's where things get tricky. But there are models of sustainable development that could work for everyone, the indigenous communities and the economy. It means moving away from just extracting resources and towards practices that are better for the environment and society.
So instead of just seeing Mapuche land as a source of timber, we need to see them as partners in developing sustainable forestry practices.
Right. Their knowledge of the land, their understanding of the ecosystem, it's invaluable. We need to understand that their well-being and the environment's well-being were linked.
It's a whole new way of thinking. We need to stop just focusing on short-term profit and think about the long-term health of the planet and the people who live on it. But is Chile ready for that kind of change?
I guess we'll see. It's not going to be easy. People who benefit from the way things are now, they're going to resist, they'll be scared of change, stuck in old ideas of progress. But the Mapuche, what they're doing, it reminds us that the way things are now, it can't last.
It's like they're saying, look, you can't just ignore injustice forever. If you don't deal with the past, it's going to keep hurting.
Exactly. And real progress, it means acknowledging the hurt, listening to the people who've been silenced, and finding ways to build a future that's fair and sustainable.
Honestly, diving into this, it's a little overwhelming. It's like peeling an onion. You just keep finding more layers. Where do we even begin with something this complicated, with all the history, the politics, the economics?
Yeah, it's a lot. But even small things can make a difference.
Like what?
Like educating ourselves. We can listen to the Mapuche, learn their history, their culture, what they're going through, share their stories, and fight against the misinformation out there.
So become more aware ourselves and then educate others.
Exactly. And as we learn more, we can see the connection between Chile and what's happening to indigenous people everywhere. We can see how it affects all of us, no matter where we live.
There's a line from the documentary that stuck with me. Nearly 5 centuries since the Spanish invaded, these Mapuche have drawn a line. No more territory will be lost. No more land will be destroyed. It's powerful stuff.
It really shows their strength, their dedication to protecting their land and their way of life.
And it reminds us, this isn't just about land. It's about who they are, their culture, their right to exist the way they want to.
Exactly. And it's a fight that deserves our attention, our support.
So why should our listener care about something happening so far away? Why should this matter to them?
Because the Mapuche, they're like a mirror for what's happening globally. This fight for indigenous rights, environmental justice, a better world, it goes beyond borders.
It's about understanding we're all connected, that what happens somewhere else affects us all.
Right. The Mapuche are on the front lines of a battle we're all fighting in different ways. A battle against injustice, against ruining the planet, against the forces that want to divide us and exploit the earth for profit.
It's easy to feel helpless when you look at all the problems in the world, but you're saying we can't let that stop us. We have to find a way to make our voices heard, to help those fighting for a better world.
Exactly. Every time we become aware, show support, educate ourselves and others, it makes a difference.
And change doesn't happen instantly. It takes time, and it's hard.
Absolutely. But it's worth it. So before we move on, I want to ask our listeners something. What can you do to help the Mapuche and other indigenous communities fighting for their rights? How can you, in your own way, support their fight for justice and a better future?
It's something to think about, and hopefully it'll lead to action. Exactly.
So we're going to pause here and pick up our exploration in the next part of our deep dive. We'll dig into some possible solutions, looking at how indigenous communities are leading the way towards a more just and sustainable world. And we'll talk about how you, the listener, can get involved and make a difference. Welcome back to our deep dive on the Mapuche's fight for their ancestral land. Before we took a break, we were talking about how this fight reflects a much bigger fight for indigenous rights and environmental justice happening all over the world.
And that leads perfectly into what I wanted to talk about next, the Mapuche situation. It's not just about who owns the land. It's about recognizing that indigenous communities often hold the key to protecting the whole planet.
Can you explain that a little more? I get the connection to the land, but how does that mean protecting the planet as a whole? Think of it this way. Indigenous communities are often like the guardians of the land. They've lived in harmony with nature for centuries. They really understand how ecosystems work, that delicate balance. Their knowledge and practices, they offer incredible insights into things like conservation, how to manage resources sustainably, even how to deal with climate change.
So we should see indigenous communities not as obstacles, but as partners in creating a more sustainable future. We need to tap into their wisdom.
Exactly. For way too long, we've thought development meant exploiting resources, even if it hurt the environment and the people living there. The Mapuche and so many other indigenous communities around the world are showing us a different way.
It's funny you should say that. One of our sources, a report from the World Bank, actually highlighted how indigenous communities play a huge role in protecting areas with a lot of biodiversity.
It makes sense. There's a lot of research that backs that up. Land managed by indigenous people often has more biodiversity than protected areas managed by governments or private groups.
So when we support indigenous people's rights, we're not just saying they deserve to exist, we're actually helping the planet stay healthy.
That's the idea. Recognizing indigenous land rights, letting them govern themselves, and including their knowledge in environmental policies isn't just about fairness, it's essential for humanity's survival.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful realization. I was feeling overwhelmed earlier, but now I'm starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just one group fighting for their land, it's about changing how we approach development, conservation, our whole relationship with nature.
That's the shift we need. We have to move away from this idea that we should dominate and just take what we want and start thinking in a more holistic way, recognizing that everything is connected. And who better to guide us than the people who have been living in harmony with nature for thousands of years?
It's time we started listening. So if someone's feeling inspired and wants to learn more or get involved, what would you suggest?
Well, there are a lot of things people can do. First, education is key. Take some time to learn about the Mapuche people, their history, their culture, their struggles. There are documentaries like the one we talked about, Chile's Secret War. There are books, articles, websites dedicated to sharing their stories.
And don't stop there. Look into indigenous communities in your own area. Learn about their history, what challenges they're facing now. You might be surprised by what you find right where you live.
Absolutely. And beyond educating yourself, find organizations that are working on indigenous rights and environmental justice and support them. Lots of groups are doing amazing work, both locally and globally.
Even just donating to a good organization can help.
Yeah, and even just spreading awareness on social media, talking to your friends and family about these issues, it all adds up.
It's about connecting with each other, showing support, and helping the voices of those fighting for a better world be heard.
It's about realizing that we're all in this together. We all have a responsibility to protect our planet and make sure everyone can thrive.
It's a great goal to work towards, and it starts with each of us taking those small but important steps. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. How will you use your voice, your actions, your influence to support indigenous rights and environmental justice? It's a question worth thinking about, and a question that we all need to find answers to.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something valuable about the Mapuche struggle and what it means for the rest of the world. And we hope it's inspired you to keep learning and find ways to make a difference in your own community.
And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check back for more fascinating deep dives into the topics that matter most.